about something different. We're going to talk about Winston Churchill. Take a look at this, which is what the Conservatives tweeted about the anniversary of the death of Winston Churchill at the weekend. A tweet that elicited this response from a Green member of the Scottish Parliament. And Ross Greer joins us now. Just for our viewers, once again, for the people in the back, Churchill was a white supremacist mass murderer. And the author of that tweet is with us now. Ross, are you saying that Churchill deliberately set out to murder millions of people?
Winston Churchill was indisputably a white supremacist and a mass murderer. History records this. The problem is that here in the UK, we are almost only allowed to talk about Churchill through the prism of not just the Second World War, but the war in Europe. Churchill's a man who declared that in his view, the Aryan race would triumph. He described Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion. And when the mass famine broke out in India, to which he was significantly to blame, the Bengal famine, he said it was their own fault because they bred like rabbits. That was despite the fact his own Secretary of State for India and a Field Marshal who was about to become Viceroy for India were in his war cabinet trying to figure out how to get food to Bengal. He personally came in and stopped them from doing that, as is recorded in both of their diaries.
Right. James?
I'm sure every history teacher has always had the one student that thinks it's really, really clever to completely trash the reputation of a big character like Winston Churchill, and they invariably get marked down because of it. This is the most superficial and inaccurate assessment. It's worth remembering that one of the reasons why the ships were not diverted to send food aid to Bengal was because we were in the middle of a war. We had been losing ground to the Japanese, and the prioritisation was to win the war. And the idea that we can now judge the language used by people born and brought up in the Edwardian era by our own standards is completely ridiculous. And so the evidence, the irrefutable evidence that we're presented with there is absolutely nothing of the sort.
Ross?
Well, it's ridiculous for James to say Winston Churchill's own recorded remarks, the diaries of his own cabinet somehow don't count. Conservatives of his day didn't trust him on India in particular. Anthony Eden, a future Conservative Prime Minister, who I'm sure James would admire, Anthony Eden did not trust Churchill when it came to India because his views were so extreme. When he was receiving reports of people starving to death on the streets, his response was to complain that Gandhi hadn't died yet. His own viceroy in India was complaining about the fact that he couldn't get Churchill to take this seriously. And James is also historically inaccurate to say it was just about food not being diverted there. We took food out of India while this starvation was happening. We took food out of Bengal while it was happening. The British occupation destroyed the boats that were required to take the food around Bengal, and we destroyed their own stocks of rice.
But bearing in mind, Ross, I must just go, but bearing in mind, as you know, Churchill is regarded by many as the greatest Briton ever. What was the response to your tweet?
The response was overwhelmingly strong. So the overwhelming majority of people who responded to my tweet agreed with it. It's over 20,000 people have in one way or another marked their agreement. Obviously, that's selection bias. Most people who follow me on Twitter would agree with me. But significant numbers of people disagreed as well. And that illustrates a much wider problem we've got. In the UK, we don't teach our own history. We don't teach the history of the British Empire. You go to India, to Kenya, to Ireland, places across the rest of the world, they'll have a far more accurate picture of who Winston Churchill was than we do, because we just don't teach it.
James?
Well, I'm half Sierra Leonean, so I'm the descendant of one of the countries that came under the British Empire. And I have to say, in all the conversations that I've ever had about Sierra Leone and West Africa's relationship with Britain during the war years, this particular interpretation of Churchill's life and accomplishments is not what I'm hearing at all.
Vince?
Well, actually, I rather agree with James on this issue. I mean, you can portray Churchill as a great liberal reformer. He was, one of the people in the great Lloyd George government. I mean, there's different aspects of his life. I mean, when you start accusing people of being mass murderers, I mean, every war leader is accused of that. But we do have a clear definition of war crimes, and he doesn't. I mean, that's not where he was. And of course, at that time, everybody who believed in imperialism, and he did and his contemporaries did, had racial attitudes. I mean, unfortunately. But
he was complicated, Churchill. I mean, should we just see him through rose-coloured spectacles, and is he viewed that way?
Yeah, exactly what I was going to do. He's complicated, it's complex and multifaceted. And you can find things that justify criticism and things that justify praise. He was a great man in some ways and an appalling man in other ways. And you can't judge and make a judgment just on one aspect. What I think is interesting, though, is how we judge people from by today's standards from then. The war really changed things. It's very interesting that Churchill was hugely popular during the war, but in the 1945 election, he was shocked to lose. And that was because time had moved on. People were looking at society differently and things have changed now. So you can't shy away from criticism. It's justified to criticise, but also don't see everything in that context, because praise for some of the amazing things he did during the war is also justified.
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge the things that great figures have got wrong. I mean, one of my heroines is Octavia Hill, who was the sort of founder of modern social work, the founder of social housing in London, but she also didn't believe that women should get the vote. So I think you have to see people as they are, as we all are, as complex people. But I think this tweet is an example of where our political discourse is going, which is a sort of Miley Cyrusisation of politics, where everyone's trying to get attention, including with little clappy hands in the tweet to sort of say, look at me. And I don't think that's particularly helpful.
Well, we only got a few seconds, Ross. So you like the Miley Cyrus of politics? Yes or no?
Heaven forbid I tweet like a 24-year-old because I'm a 24-year-old.
Ross, thank you. And thank you to all of our guests. Bye.